Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I hope you all are doing great. Today, I have a very exciting and dramatic story for you. It's about two powerful leaders. One is President Donald Trump, and the other is Volodymyr Zelensky, a strong and determined leader from another country. Imagine this: the White House, the most famous building in the United States. Important meetings happen here. Big decisions are made in these rooms. Today is one of those important days. The world is watching. Cameras are ready. Journalists are waiting to hear what will happen. Trump and Zelensky are about to meet. But will they have a friendly conversation? Or will their meeting turn into a big argument? Will they shake hands and smile? Or will they disagree and make headlines around the world? Trump smiled as he extended his hand. "Welcome to the White House, Mr. Zelensky," he said in a firm voice. His tone was polite, but there was a certain sharpness in his eyes. He stood tall, his red tie resting neatly over his suit. The cameras around the room clicked continuously, capturing this important moment. Volodymyr Zelensky shook Trump's hand firmly. "Thank you, Mr. President. It is an honor to be here," he replied, his voice steady. He glanced around the grand room, taking in the high ceilings, the golden curtains, and the large American flag behind Trump's desk. This was not just any meeting. This was a conversation that could change the future of their countries. Trump gestured toward the elegant chairs in the center of the room. "Please, have a seat," he said, motioning for Volody to sit across from him. They both moved toward the chairs, their footsteps echoing slightly in the silent room. Reporters, advisors, and security personnel stood around them, observing every movement. Some held notebooks, ready to write down every word spoken. Others watched the leaders carefully, looking for any sign of tension. As they sat down, a brief moment of silence filled the air. Trump leaned back slightly in his chair, resting his hands on the armrests. He looked at Volody with a slight smile, but his eyes remained serious. "So, let's talk," he said. "There are many things we need to discuss." Volody nodded. "Yes, many important matters," he agreed. He adjusted his suit and leaned forward slightly, showing that he was ready for a serious discussion. The room felt heavy with anticipation. Every person in the room, from the advisors to the journalists, knew that this conversation could go in many directions. Would they find common ground, or would this be the start of a heated debate? The world was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Trump cleared his throat and leaned forward in his chair. His hands rested firmly on the table, his fingers tapping lightly as he prepared to speak. The cameras zoomed in, journalists holding their breath, waiting for the conversation to begin. The tension in the room was growing. "Mr. Zelensky," Trump began, his voice steady and confident, "the United States has always been a strong country. We believe in power, in leadership, and in making decisions that benefit our people. Our economy is strong, our military is the best in the world, and we know how to win." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I think we need to focus on making fair deals, deals that put America first. That's what I believe. Strong leadership, strong decisions. That's the way to move forward. Volodya listened carefully, his hands clasped together on the table. His expression remained neutral, but inside he was already preparing his response. When Trump finished speaking, Volodya took a deep breath and leaned slightly forward. "Mr. President," he began, his tone calm but firm, "I respect your views, but leadership is not just about strength. It is also about cooperation. The world is not only about one country winning while others lose. If we want peace, if we want progress, we must work together. We must listen to each other, understand each other, and find common ground." His voice was steady, but there was a slight edge to his words. Trump raised an eyebrow, tapping his fingers a little faster now. He was not a man who liked to be challenged. "I understand that, Volodya, but at the end of the day, we have to do what is best for our country. America comes first. We cannot let other nations take advantage of us. We've been too generous for too long." His voice grew louder, more assertive. Volodya shook his head slightly. "It's not about taking advantage. It's about partnership," he replied, his tone sharpening. "If we don't work together, if we only think about ourselves, then we create more problems than solutions. A true leader finds ways to unite, not divide." The air in the room grew thick with tension. Some advisors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. The cameras kept rolling. Trump leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing. "Partnership is good," he said, his voice firm, "but not if it means America loses. I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen." Volodya leaned forward as well, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "And I am here to make sure my people are not ignored. My country's future is just as important as yours," he said, his voice unwavering. For a moment, neither man spoke. They stared at each other, two powerful leaders with two very different views. The room was silent, except for the faint clicking of cameras capturing every second of this intense moment. They did not agree, and it was clear that neither of them was willing to back down. The air in the room was heavy with tension. Every advisor, every journalist, and every security officer stood still, watching the two leaders. It was clear that neither Trump nor Volodymyr Zelensky was willing to back down. Trump suddenly leaned forward, slamming his hand on the table. The sound echoed through the room. His face was red with frustration, and his voice boomed as he spoke. "Look, Volodya, I don't think you understand. America is the greatest country in the world. We are strong because we put ourselves first. We don't let other nations dictate how we do things." His voice grew even louder, his hands gesturing wildly as he spoke. Volodya did not flinch. His jaw tightened, and his eyes burned with determination. He had met many leaders before, but Trump was different, aggressive, loud, and unwilling to compromise. Volodya took a deep breath, and then, in a voice just as loud, responded, "And I don't think you understand, Mr. President. Strength is not just about power. If you ignore the needs of other countries, you create enemies, not friends. My people, my nation, we are not weak. We will not be pushed around." Trump's expression hardened. "Nobody is pushing you around, Volodya. But let me be clear. America will not be used. We have been helping other countries for too long. And what do we get in return? Nothing. His voice echoed through the room, his fists clenched as he spoke. Volady leaned forward aggressively, pointing his finger at Trump. Helping? You call it helping? You only help when it benefits you. That is not leadership. That is selfishness. His voice was sharp, filled with passion. The tension in the room reached its peak. The advisors exchanged nervous glances. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The journalists, who were used to covering heated debates, were shocked by the intensity of the argument. Their pens moved quickly, recording every word, knowing that tomorrow's headlines would be explosive. Trump's voice grew even louder. Let me tell you something, Volady. If you think you can come here and tell me how to run my country, you are making a big mistake. He pointed his finger at Volady, his face filled with frustration. Volady stood up suddenly, his chair sliding back with a loud noise. He placed both hands on the table and glared at Trump. And if you think I will sit here and let you disrespect my country, then you are the one making a mistake. His voice was filled with anger, his words sharp like a knife. Gasps could be heard around the room. No one had expected the conversation to escalate this far. Some of the advisors whispered to each other, wondering if they should step in. The security guards subtly adjusted their positions, prepared for any situation. Trump stood up as well, now face to face with Volady. This is not how diplomacy works, my friend, he said, his voice still strong but slightly calmer. If you want to argue, argue. But don't forget who you're talking to. Volody took a deep breath. And don't forget who you are talking to, he replied firmly. The room was silent. The world was watching. Neither man was willing to back down. The clash had reached its peak. The room was filled with silence, thick and heavy. No one dared to move. The two leaders stood face to face, their expressions tense, their voices still ringing in the air. The journalists stared, unsure whether to continue taking notes or just watch the intense moment unfold. The security officers subtly adjusted their stance, just in case the situation escalated further. Then, from the corner of the room, a man slowly stepped forward. He was an older gentleman, dressed in a neatly pressed suit, his face calm and composed. It was one of the senior advisors, someone who had been in politics long enough to know that heated arguments between leaders could either destroy relationships or strengthen them. "Gentlemen, please," the man said in a steady voice, his hand slightly raised in a gesture of peace. "Let's take a deep breath. This is an important conversation, and the world is watching. You are both strong leaders, and strong leaders know when to listen as well as when to speak." Trump and Volody both remained silent for a moment. Their eyes were still locked, but the tension between them had slightly shifted. The energy in the room had been explosive just moments ago, but now there was something else. A realization that perhaps shouting would not solve anything. Trump was the first to move. He let out a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and slowly took his seat again. His face was still serious, but there was no longer anger in his expression. Instead, He gave a small nod. "All right," he said, his voice calmer but still firm. "Let's not turn this into a circus. We came here to talk." Volody studied Trump for a moment before exhaling and nodding in return. He pulled his chair back and sat down as well. His hands were still on the table, fingers tapping lightly, but his voice had softened. "Yes, we came here to talk," he agreed, "not to shout." The advisor gave a relieved smile and took a step back, signaling to the room that the worst had passed. The journalists, who had been holding their breath, immediately started writing again. Some whispered to each other, already predicting the headlines for the next morning. Trump leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "We have differences, Volody. That's clear," he said, his voice measured. "But we are both here for a reason. If we walk away from this meeting without understanding each other, we've wasted our time." Volody nodded slowly. "Agreed. We may not see eye to eye, but our countries depend on us to make the right decisions." There was another pause, a brief moment of quiet understanding between the two leaders. Then, almost at the same time, they both stood up. Trump extended his hand first. His grip was strong, his expression serious but respectful. Volody looked at Trump for a brief second, then reached out and shook his hand firmly. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment. The journalists knew that this handshake would be shown on every news channel around the world. "We will talk again," Trump said, his voice firm but calm. "Yes," Volody replied. "This conversation is not over." The meeting had not ended in full agreement, but it had ended with a handshake. It was not a victory, nor was it a defeat. It was simply a step forward, a step toward more discussions, more debates, and perhaps, one day, an understanding. As Volody turned to leave, the reporters rushed to send their reports. The advisors exchanged quiet words, and the security officers relaxed slightly. The world had just witnessed a clash of leaders, but more importantly, they had witnessed something even more powerful: the ability to step back, shake hands, and agree to talk again. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. Both leaders had made their points, but neither was willing to back down. The tension was visible. Trump sat upright, his hands resting on the table, his fingers tapping impatiently. Volody leaned forward slightly, his expression serious, his eyes locked onto Trump's. For a moment, there was silence. The only sound was the distant clicking of cameras as journalists documented every movement, every glance, every breath. The advisors on both sides remained quiet, their faces unreadable. No one wanted to interrupt the moment, yet everyone felt the growing pressure in the room. Trump finally broke the silence. "Volody, let me ask you something," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Do you really believe that your way is better? That working together will fix everything? Because I don't see it that way." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "The world is not a fair place. You either win or you lose." Volody did not hesitate in his response. "Mr. President, I don't see the world as a game. It's not just about winning or losing. It's about doing what is right. If leaders only think about themselves, they create more problems. We need balance, not just strength." His voice was firm, unwavering. Trump shook his head slightly. Balance doesn't keep a country strong, he countered. Strength does. Power does. If you don't put your own country first, who will? Volodya exhaled, his frustration growing. Power without wisdom is dangerous, he said sharply. A true leader doesn't just think about today. He thinks about the future. If we only focus on power, we create enemies. We create conflict. That is not leadership. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Advisors exchanged glances, some shifting in their seats. The journalists were furiously scribbling in their notebooks, knowing that this conversation would make history. The clash of ideas, the contrast in leadership styles, it was all happening right in front of them. Neither Trump nor Volodya wanted to give in. Neither wanted to appear weak. Yet, beneath the arguments and strong words, there was something else. Respect. They were both leaders, both men who had fought their way to the top, both men who understood the weight of their positions. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. The energy in the room was intense, like a storm waiting to break. The world was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The room was quiet for a brief moment. After the heated exchange, both Trump and Volodya leaned back in their chairs, the words they had exchanged hanging in the air. The energy had shifted. The tension, which had once been sharp and immediate, now felt different. It wasn't gone entirely, but something had changed. A sense of pause, a brief moment of reflection. Trump took a deep breath and looked out of the large window behind him, the American flag visible in the distance. The quietness of the room allowed him a brief moment to think. He wasn't used to backing down. He had always been a fighter, a man of action. But now, in this room, with Volodya sitting across from him, he had to wonder if this was just a clash of pride, or something more. Volodya, on the other hand, shifted in his chair and glanced down at his hands, resting them lightly on the table. His thoughts were not as clear as he would have liked them to be. For years, he had worked tirelessly to build his country's position in the world. He had led his people through difficult times, fought for their voices to be heard. But in this moment, sitting across from Trump, he wondered if there was a way to break through the barriers of strength and power that Trump seemed to value above all else. Could he make Trump see that leadership wasn't about winning alone? Could he make him understand that real strength came from unity? The advisors in the room sensed the shift. They could feel the change in the atmosphere. The voices had been raised. The arguments had been made. But now, there was a sense of something more profound, a possibility for understanding, even if it was just a glimmer. Trump finally broke the silence. He turned back toward Volodya, his voice softer this time, though still carrying the weight of authority. You know, I may not agree with you, but I understand what you're saying. Your people, they rely on you. You want what's best for them, just like I want what's best for America. His tone was less sharp, but there was still a firmness to it, as if acknowledging Volodya's position, yet unwilling to fully agree with him. Volodya's expression softened. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Trump's. And I understand that you want to protect your country, Mr. President. But there's more to leadership than just protecting your own. It's about creating a world where everyone can stand tall, not just the ones with the most power." His voice was steady, though there was a hint of weariness in it. He had been fighting for his people's place on the global stage for so long, and while he knew the battle wasn't over, this moment of reflection felt like a small victory. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting a golden light through the windows. It was a quiet, peaceful contrast to the heated argument they had just had. The clash of ideas had not been resolved. The gap between their viewpoints was still wide. But in that moment, both leaders understood something important. They had been heard. They had both spoken their truths, even if those truths were in opposition. And though they would continue to disagree, there was a quiet acknowledgement that this moment of reflection, of shared understanding, was a step forward. The meeting was not over, but the conversation had shifted. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about the possibility of finding a way forward, one conversation at a time. And for the first time that day, both Trump and Volodymyr felt like they might be ready to take that next step. The grand doors of the White House slowly opened, and Volodymyr Zelensky stepped outside. The crisp air greeted him as he walked down the grand steps, his face calm but thoughtful. Behind him, advisors and security officials followed closely, their expressions serious. The meeting had been intense. Words had been exchanged, voices had been raised, and a handshake had been given. But what did it all mean? As Volodymyr reached his car, a crowd of journalists surrounded him. Microphones and cameras pointed at him from all directions. Reporters shouted questions in quick succession. "Mr. Zelensky, how do you feel about the meeting? Did you and Mr. Trump reach an agreement? Was the conversation as tense as it seemed?" Volodymyr paused for a moment, looking at the eager faces of the reporters. He gave a small smile, though his eyes remained serious. "We had a strong discussion," he said in a measured tone. "We spoke about important matters, and we agreed that the conversation must continue." He did not say much more, but his words were enough to create headlines around the world. As he stepped into his car and the door closed behind him, the vehicle slowly drove away from the White House, leaving behind the flashing cameras and murmuring reporters. The meeting was over, but the discussions were far from finished. That evening, the news channels were filled with reports about the meeting. Every major television network had the same breaking news headline. On one channel, political experts analyzed the body language of both leaders. "You can see here," one expert said, pointing at the screen, "when Trump raised his voice, Zelensky did not back down. That shows confidence." On another channel, journalists debated the outcome of the meeting. "Did they accomplish anything?" one reporter asked. "Or was this just another political battle with no real progress?" Social media exploded with reactions. Some people supported Trump, saying, "He is strong. He knows how to protect America." Others supported Volodymyr, tweeting, "Zelensky is brave. He stood up for his country." Many people had different opinions, arguing online about who was right and who was wrong. In coffee shops, in offices, and in homes around the world, people talked about the meeting. Some believed it was a step forward, a sign that world leaders were willing to discuss their differences. Others thought it was a disaster, proof that these two powerful men would never agree. But no matter what people believed, one thing was certain: the whole world was watching. And as long as these two leaders continued to talk, the conversation was not over.